Hey, I've got some good news for you, and I have some bad news for you. But then I have some more good news for you. The good news is you are in control. The bad news is you may not have control over the things you think you have control over. But the good news is you probably have far more control than you actually realize. That's what we're going to talk about in today's video. So, this is Iron Sharpens Iron, and I'm Matt. And if you watch to the end of the video, you'll get a better picture of exactly what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is separating our identity, who we are, from what we do. What we do can and will uh, display who we are. And we discover who we are by looking at our actions and the things that we do. But what we do only shows who we are. What we do does not create our identity, it only displays it for ourselves and for the world to see. Now, think of yourself at a party. Have you ever been at a party where you don't really know many people, and one of the first questions anybody asks is, hey, so what do you do? And a lot of times, our knee jerk reaction, our most immediate response to that question is to tell them, what our job is. I'm a cop. I'm a banker. I work in sales. I work in retail. I'm a waiter. I'm a whatever. I'm a waitress. You know, that becomes our identity from that point. And then when people refer to us, a lot of times they'll say, oh, so and so, he works as, she is a whatever, right? But what we do doesn't create our identity. It only displays who we are. Our personality traits and character on the inside dictate what we do outwardly, which leads us down a path to a profession many times. Now, I don't know about you, but for many years, I struggled with putting too much stock or too much stake into my identity. And I didn't realize at the time that I had little to no control over what I did as a profession. I had little to no control over me being, a deputy sheriff. And there's an example from a book written by Kevin Gilmartin called Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement. It's a great book. I recommend that everybody read it. But in that book, Dr. Gilmartin talks about the concept of, we do not decide. A lot of times we say things like, I decide what type of cop I'm going to be. I decide what type of husband I'm going to be. I decide what type of whatever I'm going to be. But in actuality, we don't decide what type of anything we are. We're not the ones who decide, what we are. We may choose a profession, but the example I used to use when I taught peer support classes at the sheriff's office where I used to work is this. When I worked on patrol, I worked in a specialized proactive patrol unit, and I would often think, I decide what type of patrol officer I'm going to be. When I worked in investigations, I would say I would decide what type of detective I'm going to be. I may not necessarily decide if I'm going to be a homicide detective or a narcotics detective or, a robbery crimes unit or a felony detective. That might be out of my control. But that starts to show you that that entire identity is out of my control. As much as I would say I get to decide what type of detective I'm going to be, ultimately in that assignment, if the sheriff came down and said, we don't need you working in investigations anymore, we need you to go back to patrol, then do I really get to decide what type of detective I'm going to be? No, because that's out of my control. But then if I would say, well, I get to decide what type of patrol officer I'm going to be, what if the sheriff suddenly came and said, well, you're going back to detention to work in the jail. You're going to go work in court security. You're going to go work at the hospital. Do I really get to decide what type of patrol deputy I am? No. And then ultimately, I could say I get to decide what type of cop I'm going to be. And that turned out not to be the case. You know, not to get into the nitty gritty details of the case that I was involved in, but it didn't have to go the way that it did, but it went that way and it was out of my control. I made choices that led people to believe I did something that I didn't do. And ultimately, I was put in a spot where I was no longer working in law enforcement. Yes, it was because of my actions, but it wasn't because my actions were criminal. I struggled with depression and addiction and all kinds of things. And it got me to a dark place where people thought I could have done what they accused me of. But obviously, that turned out not to be the case. But the decision to work in law enforcement was taken away from me. But that goes for you or anybody else, regardless of your profession. You get to decide the time, the energy, and the effort you put into whatever your current task or assignment is. But ultimately, you don't get to decide what type of whatever you are. You get to decide the type of person you are, and you get to decide how much time and energy and effort you put into something, and that is what you are in control of. But you are not necessarily in control of being a banker, being a waitress, being a student, being an academic professor, being a software developer. Those are jobs you may have at the moment, but ultimately, if things take a downturn in the economy and your company starts doing layoffs and you're one of them, well, now you're no longer in control. And the reason I bring this up, why is this important? Well, the answer of why it's important is because just like I put too much stock in identity into my identity, when I got injured and I was on light duty and I could no longer work in law enforcement, that led me down a deep, dark path towards alcoholism. And ultimately, I almost committed suicide because of, let me be perfectly honest. So I was working in I was working in jail at the time, in the detention division. And I dislocated my shoulder twice over a 2-year period. And it was so severely injured to the point that I needed to have surgery. Well, now I'm off work to the point that I can't even work light duty. My son was 6 months old, and right after I had surgery, my arm was in a sling and I could not move my arm or my shoulder at all for 6 months. I could not hold my 6-month-old baby. I could not feed him. I could not change his diaper. And I remember seeing my wife do all these things. And I remember thinking, I can't even be a father. I'm not a good father because I can't physically even hold my own son unless I'm sitting on a couch and somebody gently, gingerly places him in my one good arm. And that really messed with my head. But then compound that with the idea that I can't go to work to be a law enforcement officer, and I only recently graduated the academy, 3 years before that, 4 years before that. Now all of a sudden, I can't be a cop. And that was my identity. Being a father was my identity. My marriage started to go downward and become very rocky because of all these other things. And I started drinking too much. Now all of a sudden, I'm not a good husband. I can't be a husband anymore. My identity completely shattered. And it led me down this dark road towards suicidal thoughts. But I got out of it because I read that book, Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement. But that's one of those things that I want to bring to you today. Many times we put too much stock and too much stake into our identity, but then when part of that is taken away because of something outside of our control, we have an identity crisis. Now, I wanted to look up suicide rates for active duty military versus retired military, active duty law enforcement versus retired law enforcement. And we all know the suicide rates for active duty military or active duty law enforcement far exceed the normal civilian population. That's no secret. In fact, active duty law enforcement deaths, triple or quadruple the amount of line of duty deaths due to felony assaults, and they have for years, if not decades. But my guess was that the suicide rates among retired law enforcement officers was going to be higher than that of active duty law enforcement officers. And I found a PubMed article that really outlines this. And there's a Police One article, and I'll put the link in the description below so you can look at both of those. But sorry, I want to make sure I get this correct here. The policeone.com article outlines that on average there's 184 officers, active duty officers per year who take their own lives. And the last time I saw any statistics for active duty line of death incidents was roughly around 50 or 60. So you can see that's about 3 times as much, if not 4 times as much. And there was a PubMed article that was a retroactive study, and it covers a period of time from 1950 to 2005. And I know things have drastically changed in law enforcement across America since 2005. There's no secret. But this retroactive study looked at retired law enforcement officers versus active duty law enforcement. And I fully expected retired law enforcement officers to take their own lives at a greater rate than active duty law enforcement officers. But that's not what this article showed. But there's a twist here. What they showed was that the suicide rate was actually 8.5 times higher for active duty law enforcement officers. The twist is that the vast majority of those suicides were in the last 5 years of that officer's career, right when they became eligible for retirement, or when they, the way the study outlines it is within 5 years of retirement eligibility, the suicide rates for active duty officers just skyrocketed and went off the charts. Now think about that. My guess was that retired law enforcement officers would have a higher rate of suicide than active duty officers. But what the study actually showed was that officers within 5 years of retirement took their own lives at a greater rate than anybody active or retired. And what that really shows me is that within 5 years of retirement eligibility, this identity crisis that I've been talking about really starts kicking in. Law enforcement officers about to get out of law enforcement, at least for this time period, really began to struggle with not only the traumas of the job, but also the potential conflict of identity crisis of what am I going to do once I get out of this job? And that's really what I want to outline today, is understanding that we don't necessarily get to decide what type of whatever we do as far as a job or employment. We decide. Our character is our character, and we can change our character various ways by changing our thought processes and our perspectives. But our inward character is displayed by our outward actions, and our outward actions often lead to our jobs, and we put our identity in that job. Now, the things that made me great as a cop probably make me good at being other professions as well. But as long as I identified as a cop, I was a cop. But once I was taken away, my identity was shattered, and I didn't know what to do or who I was anymore. And that led me down a dark path. And I almost took my own life because of it. And that's my goal for today's video, is to outline this for you, or possibly somebody you know who might be struggling with this, or you see them heading towards retirement, or they just recently got injured and they're off work. If you're active duty, law enforcement, or military, and you have friends that are injured and they're not active, they're on light duty, or they're at home, on disability, make sure you check on them. Because for at least my experience, for me and other people that I work with, out of sight, out of mind. The people who were on light duty, everybody forgot about them. Even more so when they're actually at home on disability rather than in a modified or a light duty assignment somewhere else. But that's when, the spiral downward towards alcoholism and addiction starts for many law enforcement officers, and probably many military officers as well. And I'm going to say first responders, not necessarily law enforcement. So check on your brothers and sisters. Make sure they're okay. And if you need help, it's incumbent upon you to reach out. I didn't for so long, to the point that my life collapsed on me because of the choices I made. But the good news, like I said, the good news, bad news, good news situation is you're in control. The bad news, hopefully this helps outline some of the things that you don't necessarily have control over, so you can take the power back and stop giving your power to things that you don't have control over. And the good news is you actually have far more control than you realize. You have control over far more things than you realize. But you've got to stop putting your control and your power and your energy into things that you don't actually have control over. So take that today. Hopefully this motivates you today. Hopefully you can share this video with somebody that might be struggling with this potential identity crisis. And hopefully we can lift each other up. Like they say, a rising tide lifts all boats. So if I can show my struggles and my dark times and what I did to get out of those, I know somebody somewhere is going to benefit from this video. And if that's you, please do me a favor, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button so you can see all the other videos that I'm going to put out on this topic or similar topics, and share this video with somebody you know, somebody you care about, somebody that you think might be struggling, so we can all help them raise their boat in that tide. So until next time, thank you for watching. I'm Matt, and this is Iron Sharpens Iron.